my story is the journey with my transgender child. His name is Chris now, but he was born in 1968, a little girl named Heidi, named after my favorite book. And at 3 years of age, she refused girl toys. She preferred her brothers, fire truck, dump trucks, building blocks, etc. She refused to allow her sister to play dolls, dress up, or anything feminine. We had a swimming pool, for which I bought her a cute girly bathing suit. She refused to wear it. Instead, she wore a pair of her brother's trunks. The only way we were able to get to church is to let her wear boys' clothes. I had darling Polly Flinders dresses and patent leather shoes. I was so sad to think she refused to look like a girl. In discussing this with the pediatrician, she said, "Leave her be. She was just a tomboy." And as soon as she turned into a teenager and liked boys, away would go the nannish outfits. The word transgender was not around in those days, so that was never thought of. When Heidi became 5 and attended kindergarten, she would not answer the teacher when she called Heidi. She said, "My name is Tommy, Butch." These names appear in her books that I have kept. She was bullied from the first day of school by the kids, teasing her because she dressed like a boy, and they called her Heidi and said, "Ha ha, you are a girl." She often returned from school with bruises, and many a day I dragged her to school. Psychiatry began early on, believing it was a mental issue. There was only one psychiatrist who ever made any headway, and that was through playing chess. The conclusion was she was far from dumb or crazy, but rather autistic and delusional. This would later make her eligible for the Rochester Psychiatric Center. In 6th grade, the grammar school could no longer contend with her behavior around being a boy. She was sent to a BOCES school where she was treated as a girl and therefore the same behavior. We then sent her to Emma Pendleton Bradley Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island, part of Brown University. They fed her heavy doses of Valium to stop her screaming. She was put on an autistic unit, which she succumbed to, began spinning in circles and stopped talking. Imagine the shock of my first visit, a month later, to learn my 8-year-old daughter no longer talked and was in such a stupor. I wasn't sure she recognized me. Heidi had not only spoken, but she sang and put on radio shows at school. I could only say she was brain frozen. I believe she was wrestled to the ground, strapped to a bed, and given heavy doses of toxic drugs. To this day, Chris does not trust many mental health staff, and it is a struggle to learn why he is so scared and hesitant to talk about himself, especially his past. I still hear his screams when I would leave. "Please do not leave me. Take me with you," whether to the RPC, MDC, Option Institute, Emma Pendleton Bradley, or Sunmount, a former prison. Here he was housed with prison psychiatric clients. I don't know where my strength came from to not go back and take him home. Her dad removed her from that institution and went to the Option Institute in Sheffield, Mass. He took a year's leave of absence from Kodak without pay, hoping to find help. Prior to this, he had visited the Mayo Clinic where they determined it was a neurological issue rather than a psychological. This began a journey of two disagreeing schools of thought. Upon arriving at the Option Institute and meeting the Kaufmans, who operated the school with the purpose of treating autism, Heidi began talking. The helmet was removed and she was able to move about freely. She was removed from all medication, foolishly, and within 2 months deteriorated to the extent of a wild animal who would not let anyone in the room with her. She lived like a caged animal. One day she said hospital. Her dad knew it was time. Reluctantly, he took her to the New York City Psychiatric Hospital. Soon after I visited her and found her strapped and sedated, I knew I must get her back to Rochester so I could monitor her care. Heidi was brought home by ambulance, strapped to a gurney because of her extreme behavior. Upon being admitted to the Rochester Psychiatric Center, I brought my mother to see her. Heidi loved her Grammy and smiled for the first time in perhaps 2 years, saying Grammy. Many tears were shed that day. Treatment continued with strong meds. She continued to be dressed in pink or yellow sweatsuits. The psychologists were puzzled that Heidi tore off this clothing. Realizing the problem, I brought dark-colored sweatsuits and masculine clothing. I was put under heavy criticism for allowing this. I was fought against to the point that I hired a lawyer to have Heidi's name changed to Christopher James. We successfully made this happen. I would guess the year to be 1982. Reluctantly, the medical profession had to call Heidi Christopher, his, he, or him. I would venture to say 75 to 80% of his negative behavior decreased. At this juncture, he was considered eligible for a group home, a good way to get him off the mental system since they did not know what to do with him. He was sent to a group home in a neighborhood which was predominantly drug addicts or alcoholics. He was made to walk to a program almost 2 miles from the home. On the way home, he was caught going into a bar and being served alcohol. Further, he was given drugs on the street corner. Returning home to his group home, the supervisor was obviously aware of his condition. He was restricted from outings and home visits as punishment. They were careless about the use of masculinity through calling him a she. Chris was such an unhappy person, he ran away, tried committing suicide, ending up in the hospital. One Christmas Eve, his dad and I were notified he was in the emergency department. We were given 2 options, take him home, or he would be sent to the open door shelter or Salvation Army. There were no available beds at the hospital, and the group home refused his return. At that time, George and I were divorced. George agreed to take him home. Thus began several years of struggling with Chris. I established a group of college students to take care of Chris while George was working. He enjoyed being with them, especially since they had no issues around treating him as he was. So we had the opportunity to play baseball, basketball, tennis, swim, finally enjoy a taste of the outside world. I was able to find a gender therapist who was discouraged by his inability to admit he was born a girl, but preferred to be a male. Therefore, Chris was refused further transgender treatment. That wouldn't happen today. He had begun menstruation and began cutting himself, along with other self-injurious behaviors. I went to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, having heard they performed surgery with little stipulation. However, they felt it was ill-advised to consider Chris a candidate because they believed he also suffered a mental component, making him not stable. I found a doctor in Rochester who, while he did not perform surgery, gave him injections to prevent the menstrual cycle. Chris visited me every other weekend. On one occasion, he started a bush fire. A passerby called police who called an ambulance. Upon being admitted, they discovered he had bound his breasts and developed gangrene. At this time, he had been seeing the head of psychiatry at the RPC. Upon learning this, he immediately admitted him to this facility. George and I knew we were at the point of no longer being able to have him live at home. Too many suicide attempts, run-ins with the police, but like most parents, we found ourselves not able to let go and institutionalize him. It was taken out of our hands. Consequently, we were shielded from the guilt of making the decision ourselves. Somewhere along the journey, Chris was transferred to Monroe Community Hospital. My recollection is he had stopped talking again and lived in a coma-like state. I dressed him in feminine clothing, mostly pink and yellow sweatsuits. There was a time when George and I had an interview with the director. When asked what we thought the prognosis for Chris would be, we said we were optimistic that he would one day talk again and function on his own out of the helmet which he had worn nonstop. The director looked at us and said, "You're pissing in the wind." If only he were alive today to see Chris. He's functioning as a male, living in a group home, attending programs, playing chess, showing a sense of humor, writing poetry, and singing songs by memory. What a shock for this poor soul. My visits were walking him in a wheelchair, strapped in so he wouldn't escape, always wearing his helmet since he banged his head. If you were to see Chris, his forehead is completely, well, they can't even give him stitches because there's no bone. It's all banged in, just totally banged in. And 3 years later, during a visit by Jim and Jody, his brother and sister, at Thanksgiving 1986, they took Chris to visit my mother. Following, we left Chris at the MDC. Jim tells of a dream he had that night, that everything would be okay. Something was about to happen. 7 o'clock in the morning, Thanksgiving, I received a call from Chris's staff shouting, "Get up here as fast as you can. He's talking. He wants to know where his mommy is. And why are these girly clothes in my closet? I'm a boy. I was so stunned, I handed the phone to Jim, and once he heard, he said, "I'm out of here. We need to get to him as fast as possible." Jody and I jumped in his car. Upon arriving, we heard him answering the psychiatrist's questions. Chris knew answers to all questions from 3 years back. He knew who the president was, different president than current. He knew our addresses. He knew our phone numbers. They did a memory test with a perfect score. So the team agrees he had not been brain dead, rather brain asleep. However, this was short-lived. He soon began his old behavioral pattern and was admitted to the Monroe Developmental Center, where he remained until 5 years ago, at which time he was moved to a group home. He is the happiest I've ever seen him. He's respected as a male, and he has not banged his head in 5 months. There is a thought that Chris is not autistic or any of the labels that were given to him, wow, but simply, I want to be a boy. My biggest fear was having to tell him, his dad, George, Chris called him Lou, passed October 2018. George gave his life for Chris. He died penniless, having spent significant funds on tirelessly hoping to find treatment for his only child. He never gave up his little girl. There was a time he heard of a conversion camp where people can be altered. I fought with his dad not to send him there. I had heard horror tales about this place. My biggest fear was having to tell him that Lou had gone to a better place. Chris was a rock and helped me through it. He has coped using the mantra, Lou isn't coming. Lou isn't coming. Recently, I took him to see Mary Poppins Returns, in which the little boy Michael's mother has passed. He is very sad until Mary Poppins tells him nothing to be sad about, Michael. She hasn't left. She's right there in your smile. I looked at Chris, who was with me, and said, see, Lou hasn't left you. He's right there in your face. And I received the biggest grin. If I were asked what has been the biggest challenge in this journey, it's the mental health system. My pages are stuck. It would be their inability to acknowledge and begin special treatments for transgender people. There is an article called Autism and Transgender, which talks of a common thread between the two. I have asked Chris's psychiatrist to read it. I have urged over and over for many years that Chris be treated by a transgender psychiatrist. So far, they have not permitted it. My goal is to pursue this in the interest of my son, as well as others being served by the DDSO who may suffer tortured existence just because they feel like the opposite sex of the one they are medically listed as. In closing, I urge all parents, relatives, and friends to open their supporting arms and care to anyone suffering from being born in a body they do not feel is comfortable or right for them. When Chris was a little girl wearing boys' clothes, I was so embarrassed and ashamed. I never, ever spoke of it to anyone in church or elsewhere. I simply said she was going through the naughty twos, which lasted all her life. If it were for Carol Quallage, who I'm sure most of you know, who took me by the hand one day and asked me, why don't you acknowledge and call Heidi a boy? I said, Carol, everyone would laugh at me. And she said, you have to be ashamed of yourself. That little boy, he wants to be what he wants to be. Why are you not loving him and caring? How can you not love that little boy as a girl. Thank you, Carol. I'll never forget it. In closing, my little girl will always be Christopher James Schwartz, the one and only consistent treatment being, I am a boy. God love him and the angels who have been with him on a tortured journey. Thank you for listening.
That is true.